Two police officers humiliated and insulted a teenage boy right in a parking lot, yelling, threatening, and abusing their power. And when Chuck Norris calmly stepped in to help, they turned on him, slammed him onto the concrete, twisted his arms, and threw handcuffs on him, convinced he would be their next victim. But just a few seconds later, the entire town learned what happens when cruelty crosses the line. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Would you be able to walk past something like this? The sun stood high over the small American town as Chuck Norris pulled into the parking lot of a large shopping center on the edge of the highway. What was supposed to be a simple stop, stretch his legs, buy a bottle of water, maybe grab something to eat, felt strangely heavy from the moment he stepped out of the truck. There was something off in the air, something tense and quietly pressed down, like a town holding its breath. He took a slow look around as he locked his door. People were moving, families with bags, teenagers with snacks, workers in uniforms heading toward their cars. But every movement looked cautious, restrained, pulled inward. It wasn't the typical quietness of a sleepy town. It was the quietness of people who didn't want to be noticed. Chuck didn't rush. He walked at a calm pace along the sidewalk beside the parking lot, letting his muscles loosen after long hours on the road. The breeze carried the scent of warm asphalt mixed with the faint sweetness of coffee coming from somewhere near the entrance. But even the normal sounds, the rolling carts, the chatter of children, the distant hum of a delivery truck, felt muted, like everyone was subconsciously afraid of speaking too loudly. Near the entrance, an older man sat hunched on a bench, his clothes worn thin, his eyes fixed on the ground. He flinched every time someone walked too close, as if expecting trouble for simply existing. Chuck's gaze followed the lines of tension threading through the scene, and eventually it stopped on the reason behind it. A police cruiser parked diagonally across 3 spaces, its lights off but its presence loud. The black and white car wasn't stationed there to respond to any emergency. It was displayed intentionally, arrogantly like a warning, and it had the desired effect. People passing by angled their bodies subtly away from it. No one dared walk too close. Chuck studied the vehicle for a moment. 2 officers were standing beside it. Young enough to still show traces of that clean-polished academy enthusiasm, but already carrying themselves with the swagger of men who had learned the town was small. The authority was theirs, and the consequences for misbehavior were non-existent. Their posture said everything. Arms crossed, sunglasses tilted just enough to see over the top of them. Boots spread wide in the classic stance of someone who thinks the world beneath them is a stage. Their gaze swept people like a scanner choosing its next victim. Chuck had seen that before many times. Places where authority had become so familiar with power that it no longer distinguished between keeping order and bullying those too afraid to fight back. He didn't come here to get involved in anything. He merely observed. He walked on. A few cars away, a teenager rode up on a scuffed-up bicycle. The boy couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 thin, nervous, with a backpack slipping off one shoulder. He braked gently, looking around for a place to leave his bike. Even his movements were careful, as if he knew any wrong gesture might attract unwanted attention in this town. He found a spot near the curb, leaned the bike against the edge, checked twice that it didn't block the walkway, and reached for the lock hanging from the handlebars. Then the officers moved. Not fast, not like men responding to wrongdoing, no urgency in their steps. They approached with the leisurely confidence of people who already knew how the scene would end. One pointed to the bike, said something sharp and condescending, his voice slicing through the heavy air. The teenager stiffened, confused. The second officer stepped closer, crowding the boy's space, pointing at an imaginary violation only he could see. The boy tried to explain. His hands lifted slightly, palms open, the gesture of someone who wanted to avoid a conflict. But the officers leaned in harder. Chuck felt his jaw tighten slightly, though he stayed where he was. He watched the boy's eyes lower, watched his shoulders drop in a way that told a long story. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. People nearby noticed too. A mother hurrying past with grocery bags sped up. A man pushing a cart glanced once, then looked away immediately, pretending to be deeply interested in the price tags in the window. No one wanted to be involved. No one wanted to challenge the uniforms. Chuck slowed his pace, though he kept walking. He didn't insert himself yet. He simply watched every step, every shift in tone, every gesture. The officers were enjoying themselves. You could see it in the small, mocking smiles, the way one of them poked the bike with his foot, pretending it was an obstruction, making a problem out of nothing. You could hear it in the tone, the unmistakable tone of men who love the sound of their own authority. The teenager wilted under them. He tried to stand straight, but his fear made it difficult. The officers closed in further, and Chuck saw the boy's fingers tremble slightly against the handlebars. That was enough. Chuck stopped walking. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing evenly, weighing the situation. He always preferred to avoid unnecessary conflict. But there were moments in life where walking away wasn't an option, not for him, and not for anyone who still believed in fairness. He approached them with calm, measured steps, nothing aggressive, nothing challenging. He didn't raise his voice or rush his movements. He merely moved close enough to make it clear that someone was watching, someone who wasn't afraid. The officers noticed immediately. You could see the flicker in their body language, the irritation, the surprise, the swelling anger that someone dared witness their little performance. One officer straightened, turning toward Chuck like a dog guarding a stolen bone. The other shifted slightly, positioning himself at an angle meant to intimidate. They didn't recognize him. They didn't know who he was. To them, he was just another passerby foolish enough to get too close. Chuck still didn't speak. He simply stood with quiet, steady presence. No posture of aggression, no clenched fists, just calm disapproval written across a stillness more intimidating than any raised voice could ever be. The officers didn't like that. They exchanged a quick glance, a silent agreement forming between them. Their attention peeled off the teenager like he no longer mattered. Now it was Chuck they focused on. The boy exhaled shakily, taking a step back, but he didn't run. He watched wide-eyed. The officers began their routine, stepping forward too close, chin lifted, arms widening slightly as if to claim the space. Their voices grew louder, sharper, dripping hostility meant to provoke. Chuck kept his expression neutral, but he already knew where this was going. The increasing volume drew more eyes. People slowed, turned, hovered, unsure whether they were witnessing something they should record or something they should avoid. A woman whispered to her husband but didn't dare come closer. The air thickened with anticipation and dread. One officer made a show of pointing to his badge, as though it were a weapon. The other jabbed a finger toward Chuck's chest, talking over him, trying to drown out any possibility of reason before it began. Chuck understood their type well. They weren't trying to communicate. They were trying to dominate. The moment one of them reached out, grabbing Chuck's wrist under the pretext of maintaining control of the situation, he felt the collective tension from the onlookers spike. The second officer circled slightly behind him, the classic maneuver of men who believed 2-on-1 was a fair fight, so long as they were the two. Chuck's breathing stayed slow, steady. He knew every step that would follow. He could feel the shift in their energy, the crude confidence rising in them like steam from boiling water. They pushed him verbally first, then physically. Their touches were not guiding, they were shoving. One nudged his shoulder with deliberate disrespect. The other tugged at his elbow like he was already a suspect. Chuck didn't resist, not yet. He gave them no reason to escalate beyond their own eagerness. But inside him, something quiet and old stirred an awareness, a readiness, a steady calculation. The officers didn't realize they were making a mistake. The people watching did. The teenager did. Chuck knew it better than anyone. But the officers had no idea how close they were to crossing a line that would change everything. They were already halfway across it, and the moment they pushed any further, the town's uneasy silence would shatter. The atmosphere around the confrontation thickened like a storm cloud gathering weight. Chuck stood steady while the two officers shifted their stance, their attention now fully detached from the teenager and locked onto him. The boy had already edged backward, gripping the handlebars of his bike as though hoping it might shield him. But this situation had passed the point where his presence mattered to the officers. They had found a new target, one they believed would give them the chance to assert the authority they loved flaunting. The first officer squared his shoulders toward Chuck, leaning in with a smug tilt of his chin, trying to force the sense of hierarchy physically into the air. His partner circled a few steps to the side, positioning himself at an angle that made it clear they were preparing for a unified advance. Chuck felt the shift and recognized it instantly. These were not men interested in resolving a conflict. These were men who thrived on manufacturing one. The officer closest to him spoke rapidly, his tone slicing through the murmurs of the gathering crowd. He didn't speak to clarify anything, nor to de-escalate. His voice was a tool sharp, overbearing, intended to dominate, to provoke. His gestures were exaggerated, his hand cutting through the air as if he were addressing a criminal rather than a calm passerby. Chuck's presence, silent and solid, only fueled their irritation. Some people in the crowd edged closer, a mix of apprehension and something bordering on hope in their expressions. Hope that someone, anyone, would stand up to the pair who had long treated this place like their personal empire. Phones lifted discreetly. A few were already recording. Yet even recording came with fear. Hands trembled, and some people kept their devices partially hidden. They had seen what happened to those who challenged local authority here. Chuck saw the fear too. He saw how deeply it was ingrained. The officer invading his space shifted again, raising his voice another notch as though increasing volume might make up for the lack of substance in his accusations. Chuck's gaze remained neutral, but every detail imprinted itself. The officer's breathing, the subtle twitch of irritation near one jaw, the mocking smirk growing bolder the more Chuck refused to flinch. Then the first touch came, not the grip to restrain a dangerous suspect, but a shove meant solely to provoke and humiliate. It was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had done the same thing many times and expected it to be the end of the story. Chuck absorbed the jolt, barely moving, and the officer didn't like how effortless it seemed. The shove was followed by a second one, this time from behind. Chuck shifted his footing just enough to stay balanced. The officer behind him stepped closer, so near Chuck could feel his breath on the back of his neck. They were trying to trap him between their bodies, hoping he would react just enough to justify what they already wanted to do. He didn't give them the satisfaction. The teenager watched with wide eyes, frozen in place. He looked half ready to flee and half rooted by the fear of what would happen if he did. Chuck didn't break his calm, even as the second officer grabbed his wrist with sudden, unnecessary force, twisting it downward as if cuffing him might be their next step. The officer still in front leaned closer, his words so close they almost brushed Chuck's face, the gesture nothing but intimidation disguised as procedure. A ripple of unease moved through the spectators. A man muttered something under his breath but didn't dare step forward. A woman clutched her purse tighter, holding her breath as though hoping her silence alone would keep her safe. Chuck evaluated the tightening ring of pressure around him. The officer's body language made their intentions obvious. They were building towards something. Each movement, each gesture, each calculated breach of personal space was another brick in the trap they thought they were laying. They questioned him, but their questions weren't intended to be answered. Their words were an accusation in themselves, delivered with the certainty of men who believed they didn't need truth to validate their actions. One officer lifted a hand to Chuck's chest, a deliberate violation meant to convey dominance. Chuck didn't respond. His stillness only magnified their frustration. Another shove came, this one harder, enough to draw several sharp breaths from the onlookers. Someone whispered, "They're really gonna do it," but nobody dared intervene. Chuck measured every angle, every step the officers took. He felt the shift from verbal aggression to physical escalation long before the officers themselves seemed ready to admit they had crossed the threshold. When they demanded identification, their tone wasn't procedural, it was punitive. They wanted him to submit. They wanted an excuse to escalate. Chuck could tell they thought they had one already. One officer grabbed more aggressively at his arm, jerking it behind him without warning, twisting with practiced malicious efficiency. The suddenness of the move jolted the nearest onlookers. A few gasps broke through the heavy air. The officer behind him stepped in closer, his hand gripping Chuck's shoulder, ready to push him into complete restraint. The message was clear. They were done pretending this was a simple conversation. They were preparing to force the situation into what they would later label non-compliance or resisting arrest, twisting reality as easily as they twisted his arm. Chuck didn't fight back. He didn't tense or pull away. He remained in control of his own breath, but he felt the invisible line nearing, the point at which their abuse of authority became not only intolerable, but dangerous. And he also sensed the subtle tremor in the crowd, fear, battling with anger, helplessness clashing with the desire to see these men finally face someone who wouldn't cower. The officers continued pressing, now pushing him a step backward, then forward again, shoving him between them like a toy passed from one bully to another. Their voices rose as if volume alone could justify the force they used. One of them, taller, broader, delivered a final, open-palm strike to Chuck's shoulder, a gesture so unnecessarily forceful that it sent a spark through the crowd. They were past posturing now. They were provoking. They were escalating. And all the while, Chuck felt the weight of inevitability settle into place. They wanted a reaction. They wanted a justification. But what they were actually doing was marking the exact moment they would regret. The moment they crossed a line they would never be able to uncross. What happened next unfolded with an ugly inevitability, as though the officers had rehearsed it 100 times on people who had never fought back. The taller officer, emboldened by Chuck's controlled silence, made the first decisive move. With a sudden, violent lunge, he swept his boot against the side of Chuck's leg, knocking his balance just enough to force him backward. At the very same moment, the second officer shoved him hard between the shoulder blades. The combined motion sent Chuck down toward the concrete with a brutal abruptness that drew a collective gasp from the crowd. The ground rushed up sharply. Chuck caught a glimpse of the gray pavement before impact, and then his chest and forearms struck first, followed by the weight of two fully geared men piling onto him. Their hands clamped down with unnecessary force, one gripping the back of his neck, the other yanking his wrist so viciously behind his back that the muscles in his shoulders screamed in protest. The officers barked orders above him, their voices blending into a barrage of noise meant to overpower any attempt at clarity or defense. Chuck did not resist. He knew better than to move instinctively, even though every part of his body felt the urge to react. He kept his breathing slow, controlled, even as his cheek pressed against the rough pavement. The sun beat down on the back of his head, intensifying the discomfort, while the air around him filled with the sharp smell of asphalt and dust kicked up by the sudden struggle. The officer kneeling on his spine shifted his stance, driving one knee harder into Chuck's back, not for control but for dominance. The pressure forced the breath from Chuck's lungs in short bursts. The second officer, sweating from the thrill of power, snapped one cuff around Chuck's wrist with such violence that the metal bit into the skin. Chuck felt the cold steel tighten more than necessary. Then came the second cuff forced onto his other wrist with equal hostility, the chain pulling sharply as the officer tugged his arms unnaturally close together. The crowd stood frozen, a few hands covering mouths, others gripping their phones with a mixture of fear and disbelief. One man lowered his phone, trembling, as if unsure whether recording would bring trouble to his door. A woman clutched the collar of her shirt, eyes wide, her children pulling at her sleeve asking what was happening. The teenager, who had been the original target of the officer's aggression, stood motionless. His face had gone pale, his knuckles white around the bicycle handlebars. Chuck could see him in the corner of his vision, the boy's horror unmistakable, guilt flickering across his features as though he believed he was somehow to blame for dragging Chuck into this. The officer gripping Chuck's neck leaned closer, breathing hard, savoring the moment, his palm pressed down with unnecessary weight, his thumb digging into the sensitive muscles just below the skull. He wasn't securing a suspect, he was inflicting discomfort. He wanted Chuck to feel powerless. Another officer, having joined the scene after noticing the commotion, made no attempt to intervene or de-escalate. Instead, he lingered nearby, arms crossed, observing with casual approval. The taller officer laughed under his breath, a short, cruel sound that carried easily in the tense silence. He stood up just enough to grab Chuck by the upper arm and pull him partially off the ground before slamming him back down again, the impact jarring through Chuck's shoulders. It was unnecessary, aggressive, and intended purely to amuse. Chuck heard several sharp inhalations from the bystanders. Someone muttered a curse. Another whispered, "This is too much," but no one dared step closer. Pressure on his back increased again, forcing him onto his side. The cuffs scraped stiffly against the pavement as the officers dragged him a few inches toward the patrol car. Their grip lacked precision and efficiency. It was all brute force. The man holding Chuck's wrist twisted it harshly, trying to elicit a reaction, something they could later use to justify escalating further. Chuck refused to give them even the satisfaction of a grunt. As they jerked him upward, one officer placed both hands on his shoulder blades and shoved him toward the hood of the cruiser. Chuck's chest collided with the metal, sending a dull ache through his ribs. Before he could fully regain balance, the officer slammed him forward again, pinning him flat against the car as though handling a violent criminal. The hot surface burned through the fabric of Chuck's shirt, but he remained still, every muscle tense not in resistance, but in discipline. A few feet away, the teenager's eyes glistened with distressed helplessness. He whispered something under his breath, words of apology or fear. Chuck couldn't be sure. The boy took a half-step closer, only to recoil when the officer who had been watching turned abruptly and glared at him, as though daring him to interfere. The teenager froze again, swallowed hard and clutched his bike tighter, torn between wanting to flee and wanting to help. The crowd continued to grow, and with it, the tension. A man in a business shirt muttered to his companion, shaking his head in disbelief. A couple stood with arms around each other, instinctively protective. A store employee in an apron peeked out from behind the sliding doors of the shopping center, then quickly withdrew, fearing involvement. The entire parking lot felt suspended in a suffocating silence, the only sound the officers' harsh voices and the scrape of boots on the pavement. The officer applying the most pressure grinned when he noticed the spectators' fear. He shoved Chuck once more against the hood, this time lifting Chuck's cuffed wrists slightly upward, forcing his shoulders into an uncomfortable angle. It was a maneuver designed to cause pain, not compliance. Another officer approached with a swagger, wiping sweat from his forehead as though he had just completed a task of great importance. Chuck felt each gesture like a cold blueprint of abuse, deliberate, repeated, cultivated. He recognized men who had long operated without consequence. He could hear the arrogance in their breath, see the self-satisfaction in the way they tightened the cuffs once more, despite them already being secured. Still, Chuck offered no resistance. He remained steady, even as they manhandled him like a trophy. But their escalating aggression was pushing him dangerously close to the edge. His calm facade was not weakness, it was resolve. He was giving them every opportunity to back away from the precipice they didn't even realize they stood upon. But each passing second made it clearer. They had no intention of stopping. They believed they had already won. They believed the man before them was just another person they could break without consequence. And it was in that moment of certainty when they shoved him forward again, when they lifted his arms behind him until his muscles strained, when they enjoyed the spectacle of the crowd's helplessness, that they unknowingly invited the breaking point. The edge was approaching, fast. The officers were so absorbed in their own dominance that they never noticed the subtle shift in Chuck's breathing, the slight settling of his weight on his heels, the quiet focus gathering behind his eyes. They had crossed the final line, and they had no idea what was coming next. The moment held for a breath, suspended between stillness and explosion, as Chuck felt the officers hauling him upright again. His cuffs rattled behind him as they jerked his arms, the metal biting deeper into his skin. The taller officer tightened his grip on Chuck's bicep, twisting cruelly as though punishing him for the simple act of existing. The second officer pressed a palm between Chuck's shoulder blades, pushing him forward toward the open patrol car door, like a man guiding livestock rather than a human being. Every shove carried arrogance. Every motion declared their belief that they had complete control. Chuck inhaled once, deeply, the slow breath steadying him. He didn't resist as they dragged him those last few steps. But under the calm, a shift had taken place within him, the moment when restraint gives way to necessity. He had given them every chance to stop, every opportunity to reconsider. They hadn't taken it. They had crossed not only the line of decency, but the line of safety. For him, for the boy, for everyone who stood watching, and for themselves, though they didn't know it yet. The officer shoving him from behind pushed harder, wanting to slam him into the edge of the vehicle. But just as his foot lifted to take another step, Chuck subtly altered his center of gravity. It was such a slight movement that the officers didn't notice it until it was far too late. The shove intended to force him forward instead encountered a man who suddenly felt like a statue anchored to the earth. The officer behind him lost his balance first. His momentum, unchecked, sent him pitching forward, and he stumbled with a startled grunt, catching himself awkwardly on the side of the cruiser. Before he could recover, Chuck moved quickly, efficiently, with precision carved from decades of experience. He shifted his weight, pivoting with a controlled motion that brought his cuffed hands downward and then back up in a sharp arc. The chain of the cuffs caught perfectly beneath the officer's forearm. Chuck twisted his torso at the exact angle required. The officer let out a choke sound as the motion turned his own arm into a lever against him. His knees buckled, and he fell hard to the pavement with a cry he tried to swallow but couldn't. The taller officer, startled, reached for his holstered weapon, but he was far too slow. Chuck had already turned his body, placing his shoulder into the officer's chest with a force that knocked the breath out of him. The officer staggered backward, his back slamming against the patrol car with a hollow thud. His hand never made it to his holster. It flailed upward as he tried to regain balance. Chuck took a half step forward, using the momentum of the officer's retreat. With his hands still cuffed behind him, he drove the short chain of the cuffs upward like a bar, catching the officer's wrist just as it reached for his belt. The pressure hit exactly where intended, enough to trigger instant pain and disable the grip. The officer cried out and crumpled sideways, clutching his injured wrist. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some phones dropped. Others snapped upward, filming fervently. The boy with the bicycle stood frozen, mouth slightly open, unable to understand how fast the situation had shifted. Chuck didn't give the officers time to recover. Years of discipline and instinct guided him as he pivoted on his heels, stepping around the officer now crawling on the pavement. He didn't need hands to fight. His entire body was a weapon. His knee came down with controlled force into the officer's upper arm enough to disarm, not to cripple. The officer yelped and rolled onto his stomach, breath knocked out of him. The second officer, the one who had been shoved into the side of the car, scrambled upright. He reached again for what he assumed was his only chance, a baton holstered at his side. His fingers brushed the handle. Chuck moved faster. He sidestepped with a smooth sweep of motion, lifting his leg and striking behind the officer's knee. It was a perfectly executed maneuver, a destabilization, not a blow meant to harm. The officer collapsed to one knee, the baton falling from his grasp and clattering on the pavement. Chuck used the officer's own momentum to guide him downward. With a twist of his hips and a sharp downward jerk of his cuffed wrists, he applied pressure just above the shoulder blade. The officer's face pressed against the pavement with a groan. Chuck knelt beside him, keeping the man pinned without excessive force, using only the angles and leverage that made resistance pointless. The officer, still on the ground, attempted a feeble rise, but Chuck shifted smoothly, tilting his torso enough that the dangling chain of his cuffs brushed against the man's forearm. It was a small move, deceptively simple, but the officer recoiled as though burned. He stayed down. A silence widened across the parking lot, a deep, stunned quiet. Then whispers fluttered through the air. Someone dropped their drink. Someone else muttered, "Oh my God!" The entire crowd pressed closer now, but not dangerously, not aggressively, just drawn irresistibly to the sight of two men who had worn their authority like armor spread helplessly on the pavement, while the man they had tried to humiliate stood above them, still cuffed, still steady, still calm. The teenager stared at Chuck with awestruck disbelief. His fear had vanished, replaced by something almost luminous. Chuck rose slowly, his breathing even. The officers groaned on the ground, one clutching his arm, the other gasping against the pavement. They weren't seriously injured, but their confidence so bloated moments earlier had collapsed utterly. Chuck took one small step back from them, giving them space without offering escape. He didn't taunt them, didn't speak, didn't even look triumphant. He simply stood there in stillness, the cuffs glinting behind his back like a reminder of just how badly they had misjudged the situation. His eyes swept the crowd briefly. People held their breath, shocked into silence. Their fear, so palpable at the beginning of this confrontation, had evaporated in the face of what they had just witnessed. In its place grew something else, something like courage, something like hope. But Chuck knew the moment wasn't over. The officers might still try to rise. Backup could arrive at any time. And the system behind these two men, the one that had allowed them to act this way, would not simply vanish because of one confrontation, no matter how decisive. Still, for the first time that day, the scales had tipped, and everyone watching knew it. Even the officers lying on the pavement knew it. Chuck remained ready. The moment of reversal had come, but the fight for truth was only beginning. The echo of the struggle still hung in the air as the two officers lay subdued on the pavement, their earlier bravado drained from them like water from a cracked vessel. Chuck stood in quiet vigilance, his hands still bound behind him, his breathing steady. For a long moment, nobody moved. The scene felt suspended in a strange silence, as if the entire town was collectively trying to understand what it had just witnessed. The tension that had once pressed heavily on everyone now shifted, loosening its grip, revealing the atmosphere beneath it, an atmosphere filled with years of fear, resentment, and unspoken frustration. The teenager with the bicycle took the first hesitant step forward. The boy's eyes, still wide with astonishment, darted nervously from the officers to Chuck. His posture remained guarded, as though afraid one wrong move might reignite the violence. But he wasn't running anymore. There was no fear pulling him backward. There was something new in the set of his shoulders, a cautious hope, fragile yet unmistakably present. Chuck turned his head just slightly, acknowledging him without speaking. The boy swallowed hard, then stepped closer. He seemed to want to thank him, to apologize, to ask 1,000 questions at once. But the words refused to form. Instead, he simply stood close enough to show that he wasn't alone anymore. And that small act, the simple boldness of proximity, seemed to break a barrier for the rest of the onlookers. One by one, people began to approach, tentatively at first, as though they feared the officers would spring back to life and punish them. When that didn't happen, the steps grew bolder. A middle-aged woman in a floral shirt walked up, her hands trembling as she held her phone. A man in work boots and a dusty jacket followed, his brow furrowed with concern. Then came others, clerks from the shopping center, elderly couples, teenagers who had been hovering at the edges, hiding behind car mirrors and columns. They began forming a loose semicircle around the scene, careful to maintain distance but unwilling to leave. Their faces were marked by something shared and heavy in awareness they had carried alone for too long. As they drew closer, the story started spilling out. Quiet at first, fractured by nerves, then gradually clearer as their courage grew. A woman explained that these officers had been harassing young people for months, stopping them for trivial reasons, searching them without cause, mocking them, frightening them. A grocery store clerk stepped forward to say that her manager had paid fines simply to avoid confrontations, because fighting back meant losing more than money. A bearded man recounted how he had been threatened after trying to report the officers for aggressive conduct during a traffic stop. Another woman spoke about a friend who had been detained overnight for disorderly conduct after asking a simple question about his rights. Every story painted a picture that was darker, deeper, and more entrenched than what Chuck had witnessed in the parking lot. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a culture, a rot that had been allowed to grow unchecked, thriving on silence and fear. Chuck listened to each person with focused attention. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence alone, steady, calm, and utterly unshaken, gave them a sense of security they hadn't felt in years. Someone asked if he was all right, noticing the bruising already forming across his arms, the redness where the cuffs dug into his skin. Chuck nodded once. He had endured far worse. What mattered now wasn't the pain in his wrists or the scrape along his cheekbone. What mattered was the truth unfolding around him. More people came forward, some showing old phone photos or blurry videos they had recorded in the past but had been too afraid to share. One man revealed a string of ignored emails to the police department, begging for oversight. Another had handwritten notes documenting encounters with these same officers and their colleagues. Yet another claimed he had once tried to speak to a supervisor, but was told bluntly that filing complaints would only make things harder for him in the future. Chuck realized he wasn't just hearing frustration, He was witnessing the release of pressure that had built up for too long. These people didn't lack courage. They lacked someone to show them that they weren't crazy, that their experiences weren't isolated, and that they weren't alone. The officers on the ground groaned, trying to regain composure, but every time they shifted, the crowd stiffened with instinctive dread. Chuck remained ready, watching them without menace but with authority stronger than their uniforms could ever lend. They eventually stopped trying to move, realizing for the first time in a long time that they no longer controlled the room, the moment, or the people. When someone mentioned calling for help, real help, not reinforcements of the same corrupt department, several phones came out immediately. People began dialing numbers they had once believed useless, speaking rapidly into their devices as they recounted what they'd seen with their own eyes. Chuck watched as more cameras angled toward the fallen officers, capturing the aftermath, the crowd, the shifting tide. Then came the moment Chuck had been expecting. The first video from earlier hit the internet. A teenager stepped forward to show him. It was shaky, poorly framed, but unmistakable. The officers pushing him, slamming him to the ground, forcing the cuffs onto him, all while he remained controlled. The next clip showed the reversal lightning fast, irrefutable. Chuck in cuffs, turning the tables with skill and precision that left no doubt about the excessive force used against him. Within minutes, more videos appeared. A woman posted hers online, her hands shaking, but the relief on her face obvious. A teenager shared his on social media with a caption expressing disbelief. The views climbed faster than anyone expected. Comments flooded in. People from outside the town demanded explanations. News sites began picking up the footage. The tide was rising, and this time, it wasn't in the officers' favor. Chuck could see the fear settling into the faces of the defeated men on the pavement. Their world, once built on unchecked power, was crumbling in real time. By the time the first distant sirens echoed faintly across the town, everyone understood that this wasn't just a fight, a scuffle, or a misunderstanding. This was exposure. This was the unmasking of a long-hidden truth. And Chuck knew the next stage would be more complicated, more delicate, and more dangerous. Videos could spread awareness, but systems didn't fall with a single moment of justice. As the sirens grew louder, people looked at Chuck, silently asking what would happen next. He couldn't promise them safety, but he could promise something else: clarity, resolve, and action. He gestured for them to stay strong, to keep recording, to keep telling the truth. Fear had controlled this town long enough. The officers groaned again, but their voices no longer ignited dread. They sounded small now, uncertain, exposed. Chuck straightened his posture despite the cuffs cutting into his skin. He could feel the weight of what was coming, but he also felt the strength of the people beside him, their stories, their courage, their finally awakened resistance. The truth was out, and now for the first time, the system behind these officers would have to face it. The distant sirens grew clearer with every passing second, threading through the thick summer air as the gathered crowd shifted uneasily but did not disperse. Normally, the people of this town would have scattered long before backup arrived, slipping away to avoid trouble, pretending they had seen nothing. But not today. Something had changed. The collective fear that had weighed on them for years now felt lighter, cracked open by the truth they had witnessed. They stood firm, phones raised, faces resolute, determined not to let the moment slip into silence or distortion. Chuck remained perfectly still despite the cuffs digging into his wrists. He didn't flinch when the patrol cars pulled sharply into the parking lot, nor when doors flew open and new officers spilled out with hands at their belts, eyes alert, ready to react to whatever scene they expected to find. But as soon as they saw their two colleagues sprawled on the pavement, bruised, breathless, and very much subdued, confusion rippled through the arriving officers. They looked from their fallen co-workers to the crowd, then finally to Chuck, the only person standing upright, calm and restrained. The officers approached cautiously, unsure of what they were walking into. Some placed their hands near their weapons, but none drew them. Not yet. The tension was thick, a mixture of shock and disbelief. One of the new arrivals, a senior officer with a rigid posture and narrow eyes, stepped closer. His gaze flickered from the injured men to Chuck, then to the dozens of phones pointed in their direction. The cameras changed everything. This was not an event that could be handled quietly or twisted into a neat report. There were too many witnesses, too much footage, too much truth already spreading beyond their control. Before the senior officer could bark an order or demand an explanation, several people from the crowd stepped forward, raising their voices at once. It was a chaotic swell of accusations, retellings, and urgent pleas. The officer tried to calm them, but the words kept coming, stories of mistreatment, threats, manipulation, and abuse. One woman cried as she explained how her son had been arrested for questioning why he was stopped. A store clerk insisted that the same officers had tried to extort money just last week. Another man angrily recounted being shoved to the ground after objecting to a fabricated ticket. The senior officer attempted to maintain control, but every eye on him held the weight of expectation. People were no longer pleading for fairness, they were demanding it, and there was no way to silence or dismiss what they'd seen today. Chuck stood quietly, allowing the truth to flow from the people themselves. He didn't embellish or interrupt. His presence was enough. The officers who had mistreated him lay in plain sight, their earlier arrogance now replaced by fear. They struggled to defend themselves, mumbling excuses about resisting arrest and hostile interference. But their voices were weak, drowned out by the damning chorus of bystanders recounting every moment of the confrontation. When one of the injured officers tried to point at Chuck and shout that he had attacked them, the crowd erupted in outrage. The teenager who had been the original target stepped forward, trembling but determined. His voice cracked as he explained how everything had started with him simply parking his bike. He described the cruelty, the threats, the unnecessary aggression. He told them how Chuck had tried to calm the situation, not escalate it. His words, shaky yet sincere, carried more weight than anything the officers on the ground could muster. Phones recorded every word. Finally, when the senior officer realized there was no immediate threat, he moved to the back of Chuck and unlocked the cuffs with a reluctant click. Chuck flexed his wrists gently, rotating them to ease the sharp ache. For the first time since the confrontation began, he had full freedom of movement. Still, he didn't lunge toward anyone or raise his voice. He simply stepped back to give the crowd space, letting the truth continue to pour out. Within minutes, more vehicles arrived, this time marked with the insignia of state investigation units. Their presence triggered a palpable shift in the air. These were not the town's officers, not part of the local circle of silence. They moved with a different posture, strict, purposeful, and alert to the cameras around them. The lead investigator stepped forward, surveying the scene with practiced efficiency. He listened to the accounts, examined the bruises on Chuck's wrists, and crouched beside the officers on the ground to ask his own questions. Their answers faltered beneath the bright glare of public scrutiny. Witness statements were taken on the spot. Videos were shared directly with investigators. People lined up to offer their accounts, eager and unafraid. It was as though a dam had burst, not only exposing the corruption, but washing away the fear that had kept them locked in silence for so long. The investigation dug deeper. The officers' reports were examined and found inconsistent. Old complaints that had mysteriously disappeared were suddenly brought back into the light, validated by witnesses who no longer feared retaliation. Surveillance footage from the shopping center, previously thought to be malfunctioning, miraculously revealed clear images of the initial confrontation, confirming every claim the crowd made. Patterns of abuse began to emerge, each incident forming part of a web the investigating team could no longer ignore. By the end of the day, the two officers who had assaulted Chuck were formally removed from duty pending charges. Their badges were taken, their weapons confiscated. For the first time in years, their authority did not shield them. Their arrogance did not protect them. Their positions did not excuse them. The crowd watched as they were escorted into separate vehicles, not with the proud stride of lawmen, but with the defeated slump of men who finally understood the weight of the consequences they had brought upon themselves. Some people clapped softly. Some simply stood and breathed deeply, as though tasting clean air after years of suffocation. The town's police chief arrived, but his attempt to restore control came too late. The investigators met him with stern professionalism, informing him that his department would be undergoing a full inquiry. His forced smile barely concealed the panic beneath it. He shook Chuck's hand awkwardly, thanking him for remaining calm, but the gesture felt hollow, like a man trying to salvage his own position rather than acknowledge the truth. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot, the investigators approached Chuck for his formal statement. He spoke simply, truthfully, recounting each moment without exaggeration. He didn't need to emphasize anything. The facts were enough. They thanked him with genuine respect, recognizing the significant role he had played, not just in ending the confrontation, but in exposing the deeper corruption beneath it. When Chuck finally walked away from the scene, the crowd parted for him with quiet admiration. People nodded, murmured thanks, and exchanged relieved looks with one another. The boy with the bicycle stopped him briefly, his voice soft but steady. He told Chuck that he had never seen anyone stand up against the officers before, that no one had ever protected him like that. Chuck placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder before heading back toward his truck. As he reached the driver's side door, he paused and glanced back at the town. It looked different now, not physically, but in the way people stood, the way they held themselves, the way they looked at one another. A shift had occurred. A weight had lifted. For the first time in years, the people weren't just surviving, they were standing. Chuck opened the door, the hinges creaking softly. He climbed into the truck, rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment, and allowed himself a steady breath. He hadn't come here seeking a fight. He hadn't intended to challenge a system. But sometimes justice wasn't planned, it was answered. And the people of this town, once silenced by fear, now had a voice again. He started the engine, the soft rumble cutting through the fading evening light. As he pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the open road, he didn't look back again. He didn't need to. The town would remember what happened. It would carry the truth forward. And Chuck, calm and steady as always, continued on his way, leaving behind a place that had finally taken its first step towards standing up for itself. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget, there are many more stories waiting for you, so check out the next video and keep watching.